Hi gang, on the far edge of the galaxy once stood the Orpheus sector, a millennia-old domain of the Imperium of Man that had endured a tumultuous history of political rivalry, Xenos assault, and Crusader conquest to emerge eventually as something of an industrial powerhouse. But little was the Imperium to suspect in the closing days of the 41st millennium that a far older and far more insane empire were about to assert their claim on the systems of Orpheus from far beyond the grave.
Did I mention we have merch? Stay tuned at the end to find out more.
The Fall of Orpheus is the story of how a single imperial sector grew, shrank, fell and rose again, only to be wiped out completely in the space of a few months at the hands of a newly awakened threat to the Imperium. It was a story told by Forge World as a standalone campaign for 6th edition Warhammer 40k, and it was responsible for taking the Necrons particularly down a far darker and more horrific path than before. So, in this video, let's go through it, what it was, and the story itself. Imperial Armor 12, The Fall of Orpheus, was released in May 2013 and written by Alan Bly. It's the second to last Imperial Armor book, and the last one to be written in the campaign format. Early Imperial Armor books have mostly been compilations of unit entries, rules and detailed technical information for various vehicles and war machines, especially the resin conversion kits and models made by the Forge World studio. But in the early 2000s, they'd shifted to the campaign format. Each hardback book detailed one specific campaign, and while some of the biggest ones, the Siege of Vrax, the Badab War, were civil conflicts in the Imperium, they also featured campaigns against Xenos powers. This way, each book could serve as the promotional material for a new Forge World Xenos range. They'd already done, by this point, Tau, Tyranids, Orcs and Eldar, and Volume 12 was the turn of the Necrons. The Fall of Orpheus is a detailed account of the invasion of the remote Orpheus sector by the awakening Maynarkh dynasty, and how Imperial forces, with little to no awareness of exactly what this new threat was, were corralled into a smaller and smaller space by the dastardly Necrons. It was accompanied by resin Necron kits, Anthracites, the Tomb Sentinel and the Night Shroud Heavy Bomber, and the featured Imperial forces were also ones that had come from other Imperial Armor books who also had resin Forge World kits at the time, the Death Corps of Krieg and the Minotaurs chapter of Space Marines. As with all these books, the design here is beautiful. The book goes through the lore in detail, much of it relayed as in-world documents and after-action reports, and then it includes variant army lists for the Maynarkh dynasty, a Necron army plagued by the Flayer Curse, as well as lists and characters for the Death Corps and for the Minotaurs, and the Dark Harvest campaign for 6th edition 40k. But I think by this point Forge World was on its way out, and it does feel like this book didn't quite have the model or lore support some of the others had. The Maynarkh aren't really ever seen again after this, even though they have some great characters and plot threads that seem intended to go elsewhere, and I think many of the models that were released weren't in print for that long. But the story itself is great. Less a story of a grand campaign or some massive universe-changing event, and more in the vein of the earlier books, a look at how a single tiny part of the Imperium can grow, develop and build itself up before being totally overrun in the space of just a few terrifying months. The eventual fall of the Orpheus sector would be swift and bloody, but the real tragedy was the millennia of warning signs, isolated events across the region that would be easy to ascribe to the mysterious dangers of the void, but in hindsight can clearly be seen as a build-up to the sector's eventual fall. The history of the Orpheus sector begins during the Great Crusade, when the fleets of humanity pushed out from Terra under the dream of unity. The region of space that would form the sector, known as the Mandragoran stars, was first mapped by the rogue trader Lady Arica Orpheus between about 570 and 750 M30. The mapped area was on the very edge of the segmentum Tempestus, just within the Veiled region, an area of dense nebula on the galaxy's rim, and was studded with habitable worlds that bore signs of ancient but long gone Xenos habitation, with remnant humans left over from the age of technology subsisting within the sinister black ruins. The region was logged for extermination and development, but soon after the Horus Heresy broke out and during the Wars of the Scouring, the region became a no man's land, known as the Dark Marches, inhabited by scattered bands of Alpha Legionnaires fleeing the fallout from the war. However, when the loyalist Raven Guard ship, Occam's Razor, entered the area during the Scouring, they found no Alpha Legion survivors left, just a mysterious charnel pit on the jungle planet of Apollyon containing nothing but piles of bones and armor. The sector was abandoned for millennia after this. It wasn't until M36, when the Segmentum Tempestus rose in power after the Age of Apostasy, that the ancient claims of rogue trader Orpheus were remembered. The Militarum Lord Tempestus of the time, Hal Orpheus, was a descendant of Arica, and he successfully petitioned and then led the Dark Marches Crusade in 900 M36, a colossal expedition led by the commander's own Astra Militarum Oathsworn regiments, with support from the Iron Champions, Angels Revenant, Red Seraphs, and Stormwalkers chapters, and the Titans of Legio Ozadax. The Dark Marches Crusade was a great success, finally incorporating the region officially into the Imperium, liberating over 600 worlds, and creating 4 new sectors: the Haxan, Layak, Eurydice, and Orpheus sectors. Hal Orpheus would become governor of the Orpheus sector, ruling from Amara, the old colonial outpost, and as colonists and settlers flooded in, the sector prospered, but over the following millennia, it was also plagued by disappearances. The journey was perilous. Colony ships frequently went missing, including a fleet of 16 million set to settle on verdant Tlaloc, though a much smaller delegation would eventually colonize that world a few decades later. This all came to a head in 917 M37, when all contact was lost with the adjoining Layak sector, with all the circumstances relating to that sealed by the Ordo Xenos. Colonization into the Veiled region was banned after this, and tithes were imposed on the remaining 3 sectors to strengthen their armies and fleets, and this additional burden would eventually lead to civil unrest. Within a few centuries, rebellions had to be brutally suppressed across the Orpheus sector, and M38 and M39 were plagued by disruption. False wars of faith, like the Black Crusade of Von Malas, caused unrest on Kolkast and Epirus, its overburdened supply lines leading to famine and the rise of rebellious cults, including one that would persist for millennia. The cult Celastarii rejected the Imperial Creed in favour of worshipping the ancient Xenos sites dotted across the sector. Their writings filled with prophecies of a time when the stars would explode and darkness descend on the Imperium. They were, of course, ruthlessly purged wherever they could be found. But disappearances continued, often attributed to known Xenos threats. Garbled signals from Tlaloc in 889 M38 warned of massacre and darkness, and a patrol fleet investigating discovered a charnel house. The million-strong population killed in hours, and all data storage devices wiped clean. The Ordo Xenos reports suggested Eldari Corsairs from the Veiled Nebula. And in 169 M39, the constant low-level Orc activity in the region flared up again to an extent that the Red Seraphs and the Revilers chapters pushed a new crusade into the Orc-held Gorgon deeps in order to destroy the Orc fleet. The last heir of the House of Orpheus was succeeded at M39 by a new governing house, the House of Lan, who governed with significantly less authority than their predecessors, and the sector fractured politically, almost descending into civil war as nobles and governments plotted against each other. The honor clans of the Drusilian cluster attempted to declare sector secession, and the nobles of Amraphel hired Xenos mercenaries to strike against their rivals, those nobles eventually being slaughtered by the crave they'd invited in, and during this time Apollyon, Kolkath, and Selekar fell under the sway of agents of the ruinous powers. However, this gradual decline during M39 would be purged in the fires of faith. After ecstatic visions, the arch-confessor Marduk of Helmavon declared a massive war of faith for the soul of the sector in 903 M39, claiming the God Emperor warned him of a terrible threat in the region that would cause the sector to fall into shadow. Regiments of the Astra Militarum, the Battle Sisters of the Order of the valorous heart, and the Astartes of the Angel's Revenant flocked to his banner, and the Orphean War of Faith swept through the sector, eventually purging a fifth of the population in 2 decades. By 921, the only remaining Chaos stronghold was the fallen hive world of Kolkast, held by the heretic Astartes of the Deathmongers. But when the strike cruisers of the Angel's Revenant sent to assault the planet were disabled by unknown Xenos vessels at the system edge, they could only watch as a mysterious alien fleet appeared from nowhere and then systematically scoured clean the planet before disappearing without a trace. The world would ever after be known as St. Marduk's Bane, as the Confessor died soon after, but no explanation was ever found for what destroyed the Chaos forces. Anyway, with the campaign complete, another era of expansion occurred. Colonization grew as victorious Imperial Guard regiments settled the planets. Apollyon was given over to the Inquisition due to the high levels of warp saturation it had suffered under the rule of Chaos. The world of Moros Lacrimel was designated first a penal colony and then a training world for penal legions, and Libethra was converted into a shrine world and a permanent home for the previously fleet-based Angel's Revenant. By M40, the sector was a prosperous military stronghold. The orcs of Badrock were finally crushed, and the sector pledged millions of fighting soldiers to the Emperor's wars. The only major disruption was an attempt by the industrial world of Decapolis to take over the role of sector capital from Amara in 619 M40. The hierarchs of Decapolis used targeted assassination and fomented political unrest, causing cults to appear across Amara, notably including a resurgence in the cult Celestari, who had never really been wiped out. But when the weapons used by the cults were traced back to the factories of Decapolis, the Inquisition swept in, and a series of punishing show trials ended the conspiracy. This period of general prosperity continued until late M41, when warps, squalls, and disturbances increased across the sector. By the end of the century, latent psychers across the region were waking, nightmares of dead cities and silent worlds in their minds. Warp incursions became more common, and as communications became more difficult, power slowly slipped away from Amara itself. In 689 M41, the Howling Vortex formed from a nearby warp storm and cut off the penitent world of Moros Lacrimel, and soon after, in 744, the cult Celestari rose again, this time linked to a string of murders and thefts of Xenos artifacts at the Kellerman Skolam, including reports of a metallic burning figure striding through the ruins of the Skolam's museum. Then, in 811, the clearest warning to date came when the Wayward Sun, an escort vessel from the fleet of the rogue trader Caleb Gilderoy, appeared on the edge of the Adeptus Mechanicus system of Harrow's Watch, damaged and broadcasting messages warning of a terror from beyond space. However, without the correct Adeptus Mechanicus clearance codes, it was rightly destroyed attempting to enter the system any further. Finally, amid growing cult activity and celestial phenomena, the void lit in 990 M41 when a major warp disturbance in the north of the sector suddenly burned out, followed by the unexpected supernova of the binary stars of the Caracol system at the very edge of the Veiled region. The Imperium largely recorded this as a freak stellar occurrence, but the event had long been portended in the writings of the cult Celestari, who suspected what was to come. A year later, in 716-991 M41, doom came to Orpheus. But unlike the supernova, the initial stages of the war would be silent. Without warning, a score of systems on the edge of the Veiled region fell into silence. No reports, no astropathic distress calls, just silence, like a veil had been drawn across the stars in a wide curve, encompassing Harrow's Watch, Palisade, Catris, Boris Landing, Ayith, Apirus, Klarlock, and many more. So huge was the change, and so precarious was communication at the time, that the scale wasn't even noticed at first until a burning black ship appeared outside Amara and transmitted its warning to the local inquisitorial fortress. The true scale of the assault was discovered only slowly as picket fleets ventured into the black, often becalmed in the silent void. The silence even swept the communication network, and while a general call to arms was issued and warp-capable ships spread the call to war, no one knew what they were meant to be fighting against. Even the Angel's Revenant fortress on Libethra was unresponsive. In haste, plans were drawn up for potential responses. Naval commanders called for a united front for sorties into the darkness, often to push for Libethra, since surely nothing could have overcome the local Astartes chapter. But with no direction, no attacks were launched, and a policy of build-up and defense was adopted, championed by two prominent figures. The sector governor, Calibron Lan, was a disliked and cowardly individual all round, but his standing orders seemed sound at the time. He authorized the redeployment of Amara's forces into a united local fleet and drew in ships and soldiery from smaller worlds further forwards, building a formidable fleet at the capital world, even if others were abandoned to feed it. Whenever the threat became known, there would at least be a strong task force to meet it, and Lord Inquisitor Hiram Nshona supported the governor. As a prominent member of the Ordo Malleus and a respected demon hunter, he concluded that the silence must be the work of chaos, maybe the precursor to a much larger attack to come. He had called for aid and agreed that nothing should be ventured before his reinforcements arrived. But the weeks went on with no change, and in the silence, terror gripped the sector. But when the Vox lit again, things would just get much worse. On 806-991, void auspexes across the Orpheus sector were blinded as the Veiled region came alight with stellar lightning. Local communication networks, deep void surveyors, all blared into life with a mass of terrified communications, all the screams of the sector released at once as if frozen in time from when the veil was first drawn. Ancient machines were overloaded and failed, their screens bypassed with reams of static, and beneath all the noise was a message. Maynarkh comes. Long before the 41st millennium, even long before the war in heaven and the changes that turned the ancient Necrontyr into the Necrons, the Maynarkh dynasty held a sinister and brutal reputation. The Maynarkh were a mid-level power in the ancient Necrontyr Empire, famed for their martial prowess and the strength of their legions, but also well known for a streak of unrelenting cruelty that many of the other dynasties found distasteful. The stench of blood, as it whispered, was upon them, and it saw the dynasty repeatedly hampered in its attempts to grow. Even its domains became isolated in the far southwest of the galaxy. Sidelined in the great game of dynastic politics, this paradoxically made them even more aggressive. If they couldn't rise through the games of court, they would rise by conquest and aggression. But while the Maynarkh dynasty was a social pariah, the Silent King had long been a patron. He certainly saw the use of such a bloody-minded force, and when the Necrontyr underwent the great biotransference and became the Necrons, the Maynarkh were at the forefront of its wars. The Maynarkh were the bloody right hand of the Silent King, campaigning across the stars and fighting both the servants of the Old Ones and the Necrons' former masters, the Catan. Legend has it that they were responsible for the obliteration of the Catan Chlandrugor, the Flayer. But while they enjoyed a sort of grim fame, in the latter years of the war, they became even more of a pariah. Chlandrugor is said to have cursed the Necrons with the horrific Flayer virus, a degradation of the mind circuitry that causes the afflicted to thirst for the flesh once again, feasting uselessly on the blood of their enemies and draping themselves in their skin. And while the curse affected the entire species, it was Chlandrugor's murderers, the Maynarkh, who were afflicted first. The royal court of Maynarkh began a torturously slow descent into madness as the curse of the Flayer started to spread through its upper echelons, the ritualized forms of warfare they were once devoted to devolving into compulsive genocidal slaughter. They were shunned even more, and when the Great Sleep came, many dynasties urged the Silent King to end the Maynarkh forever, but instead he hid them from the prying eyes of the other powers, safe in their remote but galactically stable, at least, domains. Sure that he would need such an effective military force again, their awakening linked to a predicted cosmic event, the deaths of the binary stars of Karl. And in the 41st millennium, when the pattern of the stars altered, the core worlds of Maynarkh had started to wake. Many had devolved. Ravening packs of flayed ones prowled the corridors of their tombs, but the core of their forces were intact, and serried ranks of warriors, praetorians, and war machines slowly rose to wakefulness. But even when the Flayer curse had not fully taken hold, its touch had affected the minds of the cryptex and lords of the Maynarkh, combining or maybe finding some sympathy with their already bloodthirsty tendencies. The mark of the Flayer had affected them all in some way, but its leaders rose for the first time in millions of years, content that they were still in control of this curse. Bloody-handed overlords such as Mactlan Kutlach and Ixatotek, the Lord Hunter of the Void, war-obsessed cryptech scientists such as Tlazolt the Faceless and their Ferak Zumbakir, Mother in Oblivion, and they took stock of their worlds. As before, the only goal would be genocide, the extermination of any younger races, and a new one had landed on their doorstep. Their worlds, their ancient empire, had been usurped by this new species, mankind, that had encroached on their sovereign domains. And as per the ancient ways, they simply had to be removed. This would not be a war, but a cleansing, a dark harvest of an inferior species. Their armies would wake, and the ancient law of the Necrons imposed. It was simply the only thing to do, the ancient lords told themselves, as the Flayer virus slowly ate through their minds. The Voxasol of 806 meant that the veil had been lifted, and the Orpheus sector collapsed into panic as its inhabitants realised the fate of the first wave of invasion. Libethra was lost, along with the entire Angel's Revenant chapter, its shrines and tombs replaced with a sea of shifting black sand. As the darkness spread and the fleets of the Maynarkh dynasty pushed onwards, the inquisitorial world of Apollyon was destroyed, its own moon smashed into its surface, and the systems of Midwinter and Amrafel devolved into mass hysteria. Reinforcements were inbound from the Eurydice sector, but Orpheus was on its knees before Maynarkh even revealed themselves. The second wave of the attack began in 917991. Drusilla Majoris fell silent, garbled messages warning of basalt black columns rising from the ground. Metallic figures appeared on Midwinter's orbital fortress Taris, slaughtering the crew before Midwinter itself went silent. One by one, systems fell on a slow path to Amara, their last broadcasts often being cries for help from the capital, but still Governor Lan refused to send any aid. All assets, all refugee ships, all military vessels that escaped the darkness were incorporated into the grand battle fleet at Amara as Lan retreated to his private bunker complex beneath the surface. None of the small Imperial patrols still out there could stop the Necron advance. Counter-assaults fell to darkness, and soon the only cries on the Vox were pleas for aid from Amara itself. By the end of the bloody 100, the first 100 days of the invasion, the entire sector was on its knees, and then, again, everything went silent. The absence of any Necron assault made things worse. The citizenry of Amara had been on a war footing for months. Millions of soldiers deployed to defend its three major hive cities. Reinforcements had started to arrive in the sector, but the governor's policy saw many of them deployed directly to the defense of Amara's cities. Death Corps regiments under Marshal Caris Venner deployed to the planet, accompanied by Necromundan, Tekhan and Jopal forces, and 5 Astartes chapters sent task forces, most notably the Minotaurs chapter, who deployed in full chapter strength, led by their chapter master, the grim Asterian Moloch. The force built up at Amara was by this point the largest force ever amassed in Segmentum Tempestus, but Lan and Nchona still refused any attempt to go on the offensive amid increasingly stringent calls for some sort of action. Nchona was still convinced that this was some sort of chaos incursion and that this was only the beginning, but Lan had become more and more paranoid. He woke screaming from dreams of a banquet where metallic figures draped in flesh forced him to eat. In retrospect, it seems likely that the governor had been compromised in some way, possibly abducted, and his actions controlled in such a way that would give Maynarkh the noble single battle they desired. But all of this was only theorised much later. If those were the plans of the dynasty, then they had borne fruit, as the Necrons' next move would be on Amara itself. The Battle of Amara was the only decisive conflict fought by the Imperium during the entire fall of the Orpheus sector. At 970-992, the colossal battle fleet stationed at the anchorage of Layman on the edge of the Amara system was blindsided by a mass gravitational event further in-system next to the star. Flashes of energy scrambled the Vox as the Necron fleet materialized behind the defenders and went directly for the capital world itself. The outlying Sentinel-4 station was swarmed by curved black Xenos ships, then the other Sentinel stations and the orbital defenses powered up as the world came under assault, all while the fleet at anchor, in perfect defensive formation for attacks from outside the system, attempted to come about. On the planet, defenders died by the thousand. The tactical Vox, laced with disruption, reported simultaneous attacks everywhere. An army of black iron materialized at the Dunarad starport, denying any off-world escape, and swarmed the plazas of the Kalasheen hive. Flocks of night scythes and doom scythes destroyed the largest arcology, New Vasburg, with anti-matter bombs, the ancient hive buildings collapsing on their occupants. The three hive cities were the main targets, the Maynarkh's campaign centering not on territory but on cleansing the world of human interlopers, but smaller Necron forces went for the military deployments. Hulking monoliths besieged the polar defense fortress of the Bastion Militaris, tearing apart the mountains with lashing energy as orbital strikes from the unchallenged Necron fleet wiped out the barracks of the Markovan Peninsula, annihilating 1 million guardsmen in a couple of hours. The forces on the surface fought back wherever they could. The Tekhan armoured formations formed long-range cordons, barrels glowing as they held back the tide at Kalasheen, their commando units deploying into the rubble of the city to halt any counterattack, and they held out for hours, eventually ripped to shreds by insect-like anthracites and stalker constructs that emerged from the ground. But the most successful counter was by the Krieg, who had deployed into the warren of craters, trenches and ruins created in the first few days of fighting. Though again assaulted by tunnelling stalkers and constructs, the soldiers of Krieg were disciplined and more than used to this terrain and managed to hold back the Necron advance for days. Marshal Venner was under no illusion they could actually win in the long run, but they were given a chance to make a difference when Minotaur recon elements deployed to the planet located a strange black pyramid rising from the ground in the rubble outside New Vasburg hive. Venner redirected his assault brigades, breaking off from the Necron assault and drawing up new lines across the city. Advancing on the pyramid complex, their mobile artillery, a massive number of Armageddon-pattern basilisks and Medusa siege guns, opened fire. A wall of munitions fell on the black tombs of the Necrons, forcing the Xenos to direct their energy beams upwards to intercept shells, and as this happened, the first wave of Kriegers were ordered into assault. Tank companies roared into action, hundreds of thousands of men swarming the site, and though many died to lone stalker attacks or to metallic warriors emerging from green-tinged portals, the tidal wave of humanity flowed around the Necrons, far more than the wakened warriors of the Citadel could muster. Lightning gunships ran suicide sorties, and the artillery was eventually bled dry as their crews came under attack from Necron infiltrators, but by this point it was too late. The second wave had been ordered in by Venner, overrunning the Citadel completely and affixing demolition and breacher charges to its walls. Though by this point all three hives had been reduced to rubble, the defenders fought on, and when the Black Pyramid at the centre of the emerging complex finally detonated in a flare of green lightning, it was said it could be seen from orbit. Of course, in orbit, the people watching probably had better things to do. The Black Necron fleet had turned around after disgorging its invasion force, and the colossal Imperial fleet, under Grand Admiral Carew on the Arica Dominus, had turned to face them. His orders were to maintain strict formation, and as the Necrons came into view, the Admiral was confident. Their numbers were paltry, around 20 harvest ships led by two great monstrous tomb ships that had been labelled the Dead Hand and the Sun Killer by the Imperial Strategos, with a swarm of escorts. This was less than a quarter of the tonnage of the vast Imperial fleet, who advanced in formation, presenting a wall of steel. As the Necrons closed the range, the entire Imperial fleet unleashed its volley of torpedoes, filling the void with ordnance. It seemed the smaller Necron fleet stood no chance, but when the torpedoes reached the Xenos, their tracking signals just cut off or veered wildly away, their guidance systems infiltrated, and their motive units dying. Scythe-shaped ships wheeled and rolled around the inactive munitions, and carnage erupted as the two fleets tore through each other. The initial pass was chaos. The Imperials attempted to hold true their formation, unleashing opportunistic broadsides at the dark ships as they screamed past, but when the two fleets separated, the damage was clear. A quarter of the Imperial fleet had been destroyed by flashes of otherworldly lightning, cut in two by dark energies from the ancient days, and the Auspex officers recoiled in horror as the Necron ships turned on a dime, faster than anything should be able to turn, and tore back into the Imperial fleet again. Dozens more ships died before Karl issued the order to finally break formation and act independently. The flagship, the Arica Dominus, turned as fast as it could, annihilating a harvest ship with a full broadside, but the explosion was so close the old battleship was severely damaged and it tumbled away with no helm control. Necron ships wheeled through the battlesphere like vultures as the officers of the Navy were driven mad with terror and panic. But watching coldly was a whole other Imperial force, and it was now that it chose to commit. Arranged as a second echelon was the entire Minotaurs chapter fleet, led by the ancient assault cruiser, the Daedalus Krater. They had purposefully stayed separate, not committing as the massive Imperial fleet was picked apart, using the deaths of their allies as an excuse to study this new enemy. It was clear that conventional Imperial void tactics would not work against such a maneuverable foe, and so with the Maynarkh fleet now feeding on the naval armada, the Minotaurs adopted much more direct tactics. The entire Minotaurs fleet waded into the fray, arranged like the horns of a bull, aimed directly at what Asterion Moloch had decided was the lead ship, the Dead Hand, the ship that had acted first and seemed, from their observations, to be in command. As their centre tore into close range and their flanks burned in to surround the war zone, the entire Minotaurs fleet unleashed its firepower, shredding any remaining smaller ships in the way, Imperial or Necron alike. Stricken Imperial ships were ripped apart, curved Necron vessels caught in a savage crossfire. Return fire from the Death's Hand destroyed the Daughter of Tempests, once a Lamentor's cruiser taken in the Badab War, and scattered a squadron of Minotaur's escorts, but the charge pushed on, and at point-blank range, the Astartes launched their boarding torpedoes. A dozen craft pierced the hull of the Dead Hand, Minotaur's assault teams cutting their way through swarms of Canoptech machines inside the dark hull of the tomb ship. Space Marines fell every step of the way, torn apart by half-mad warriors covered in stinking flesh, their armour ripped open by swarms of scuttling scarabs, but they pushed on, searching for targets of opportunity. It was Terminator Squad Ixthalion who finally managed to penetrate to the centre of the vessel, emerging into a vast space kilometres across, studded by lightning-wreathed obelisks. At the centre of the space stood a vast dais, atop which was surely the commander of the ship, an ancient and monstrous overlord, surrounded by his Praetorians. The Necrons responded immediately, and the Terminators were torn apart in seconds, but it didn't matter. Their targeting data had been sent. The Daedalus Krater, at this point within ramming distance, opened fire on those coordinates, and its bombardment cannon blasted a hole through the black hull of the Dead Hand, exposing the central chamber not only to the void, but to teleport lock. And as the vast ship careened away, even as it clipped the edge of the Daedalus Krater, the ship's ancient teleportariums ignited, and Asterion Moloch, 30 Terminator veterans and 2 Hecaton dreadnoughts appeared in the central chamber. The fighting on the Dead Hand was brief and brutal. The Terminators tore their way towards the dais, legions of metal bodies falling beneath them, but there were always too many. Terminators fell, ancient Contemptors duelled with hulking Tomb Guardians, and while Moloch, aided by the Hecaton ancient Gyron, finally cornered the Necron Overlord and duelled with him, he simply couldn't land a mortal blow. Even slamming the Black Spear through the back of the Overlord only damaged the Necron Lord a little, and Moloch was forced to defend himself again and again, his relic Storm Shield coming apart under repeated blows from the Necron's curved staff. He was only saved when the ship lurched once again, hit by some punishing event outside in the void, and the surviving Minotaurs were expelled into space. The dead hand tore its way out of the battlesphere, careening like a wounded beast, leaving behind the burning wreck of the Minotaurs barge Fidelitas Lambda. Its last act had been to ram the Necron vessel amidships and force its retreat. The Necron force, falling back now, split. Some retreated to the innermost world, Auric, which soon became surrounded by black storms, and the rest, including the dead hand, vanished into the void. The Necron fleet had been forced back, but at the cost of the sector and the planet. Less than 10% of the Imperial battle fleet survived the battle, and billions lay dead on Amara, and the war was far from over. In the following years, Necron assaults on the outlying worlds of the region continued, though none at the scale of the Battle of Amara. Despite technically winning the battle, by 995 M41, the Orphean War was declared by the Imperium an untenable stalemate. Military forces had been pulled back from Amara, first to the outer system to regroup, abandoning any civilians on Amara Prime to their fate, and then to Hydragast as tendrils of the Maynarkh continued to assault the nearby systems. With probing attacks reaching as far as Maya and Amrafel, it was clear that without a new, even larger crusade force, the sector would fall, and such a force was simply not available. With reluctance, the Synod Militarum Tempestus enacted the Exterminatus Firebreak Protocol in 999 M41. By the writ of Holy Terror, the Orpheus sector was dissolved, its rights, tithes and duties annulled, and the worlds and any defenders remaining in the sector given the gift of martyrdom and the Emperor's blessing. May they fight long in his service. The Forge world of Maya was scoured, its data looms relocated to a new colony world of Jurgath, ceded to the Mechanicum in compensation for their loss, and finally the Minotaurs chapter of Astartes were charged with enacting exterminatus on the worlds of the former Orpheus sector, scouring them of Imperial and Xenos life alike. Orpheus had fallen. And that's the story. It's not the biggest or the most wide-ranging war in the history of 40k, but what I like about it, and what I think the Imperial Armor series was really good at, is how it gives the sense of what a typical conflict in the 40k universe feels like. The Orpheus sector, like all the other sectors, has this massive history. A good third to a half of the lore in this book is devoted to chronicling how it became such a complex, interwoven area of the galaxy, and that entire area can then just be snuffed out in a matter of months and forgotten. Just another blip in the vastness of 40k, failed by one poor leader or by a simple lack of knowledge about what they were facing. In fact, the Maynarkh characters, though they don't actually feature in the main story by name, are given a huge write-up, something that leads me to think that there was meant to be some sequel to this, some future life for this amount of detailed lore. In the grand scheme of 40k, this campaign was nothing. Another sector lost just before the Great Rift would spread and half the Imperium would go with it. But it's a nice window into how complex and precarious life is in the Imperium of 40k, and I do like it when they turn it all spooky. Thanks for watching. And if you'd like more on the famed campaigns of Warhammer 40k, there'll be some videos coming up there on the right. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can like and subscribe. You can become a member on YouTube or Patreon and get early access videos and submit questions to our book club. And of course, you can buy merch. All of that stuff is in the links below. See ya.